establishment of Islam in Algeria were completely destroyed by the French.
In Algeria by the French.
Yes, by the French, exactly. They actually tried very actively to disconnect Muslims from Islam.
So what they counter as radical Islam, in quote-unquote radical Islam, is actually to enforce radical secularism. What you're saying is they're going to criminalize the word.
We're expecting them to essentially condemn Elias, which essentially means that the word intifada, essentially you won't be able to use it as freely as before, or if you do, you will essentially take a very high risk of being charged by the state, which is something completely unprecedented.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم Rayan Freschi, is that correct?
Freschi.
Assalamu alaikum Freschi. So, how are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for the invitation. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for joining the program. I hope like a lot of people benefit from your program and they learn from you and they reach out to you as well. So we'll put in the description what are the works and who's Rayan and what are his works. So Rayan, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm a researcher for Cage International, and Cage International is essentially a Muslim NGO based in London, but its reach is quite international. And we were established almost actually more than 20 years ago because as a result of the scandal of Guantanamo, the detainees that were there tortured, and our organization was one of the first ones to uncover the torture that took place in there. And Cage was actually the organization that unveiled the first list of the names of the detainees in Guantanamo. Some of you guys might not recall, but at the time we didn't even know how many people were there. We didn't even know their identity. And Cage was, the first main victim of Cage was the publication of that list, and that list was taken and published by the Washington Post in 2006. And slowly but surely, the organization grew, and its remit, of course, is still focusing on Guantanamo because Guantanamo, unfortunately, is still open. 30 brothers are still being held in there, and we hope that, inshallah, the facility will be closed down at some point, and we hope that the brothers will be freed at some point. But the reach expanded, and we started to essentially my colleagues started to work on the expansion and the implications, the ramifications of the war on terror, of course. And so essentially the war on terror was started by the US and NATO, essentially the West, against the Muslim world after 9/11. And of course, it started with the invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, and so on and so forth. And it led to a series of, as I mentioned, wars, invasions in the Muslim world. But it also led to, let's frame them, cold wars in the West as well, where Muslim communities were more and more targeted through policy, legislation, discourses that were directly influenced by the overall war on terror, by this overall effort and endeavor against Islam and Muslims. So in essentially the remit expanded from Guantanamo to the policies influenced by the war on terror in the UK and the US. And in the last few years, Cage decided to work on Europe as well, and more specifically to work on the French context. And I myself am based in Paris. And the reason why Cage decided to work on the French context is because you might recall that a few years ago there was a series of dissolutions that took place in the country. Where a dissolution is essentially the government deciding to definitively close down some organizations. And one of the organizations targeted by the government was the CCIF, essentially the main anti-Islamophobia group in the country, and these. So
let me come to this point a little bit, a bit further. But can you tell me about the Guantanamo. So, are these people from Iraq that are transported to Guantanamo, or are these people Muslims in the West, like in the US or in the Europe, that are transferred to Guantanamo? So, who are these people exactly?
Most of these brothers, they come from the entire. There's a brother that used to say that the only criteria is to be Muslim. So they come from the entire world. There were. They came from Afghanistan, they came from Pakistan, or there were at times people who were in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, but were not necessarily Afghanis or Pakistanis. So there's a series of almost the entire set of nationalities is being represented in Guantanamo. The two main criteria are Islam and being a male, essentially.
Being a what?
A male.
A male. Okay.
So they are not, but of course, some of them grew up in the West, but were in Afghanistan or in other places, and then were sent to Guantanamo, essentially.
Okay, so when you told me that the French government was targeting Muslim organizations, because I might not know and the world might not know, maybe French people know it. So can you explain what happened, when did it happen, and which organizations, why did they target Muslim organizations all of a sudden? Was it because of the Paris attack, or was it like before that? Can you brief us a little bit about the history?
Yeah, of course. So essentially what happened in 2020, we were in the midst of a new policy established by the government in February 2018, essentially a few months after the presidential victory of Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron comes to power in 2017 and very quickly decides to establish a policy entitled the Systematic Obstruction Policy that was aimed at targeting the entire Muslim community. And the spirit, the overarching spirit of that policy was to essentially frame Muslims as being inherently violent, barbaric, and that needed to be cracked down upon very severely. So as a result of that policy, tens of thousands of establishments, at least 31,000 Muslim establishments, were and are currently being harassed by the state. When I'm saying establishments, it's important to realize we're not just talking about mosques or Islamic schools. It's literally any establishment, NGOs, restaurants, businesses, any businesses that are led by, that are Muslim-led essentially, are being targeted as we speak by the government, by the administration. As a result, more than 1,100 organizations, establishments, I should say, were actually forcefully closed down by the state. And at least, I think the current amount is 55 million euros were seized by the government from the Muslim community.
And this was only in 2018? Is that what you said?
Since 2018.
Until today?
Until today, and it continues. It's still.
And is it escalating more, or is it de-escalating? Like, are they?
What I would argue that is the pace is essentially more or less the same since 2020. Because imagine that at first, in February 2018, Emmanuel Macron establishes that policy, but it was completely secretive. There was no public announcement. There was no public document was being released by the government. And it was essentially secretive for a year and a half. So from February 2018 to November 2019, no one knows that this is happening. There's no public recollection of that. And in November 2019, the Home Office comes out and delivers a statement to some officials and says, well, we've been doing this in some areas of the country against the Muslim community. It's quite successful. And from now on, we're going to essentially apply it to the entire territory, to the entire nation.
So when you say entire nation, France has overseas territories like French Polynesia. So everywhere.
Everywhere, essentially everywhere.
Okay.
And so it became public and nationwide from November 2019 onwards. And this comes as a result of we must understand when we're dealing and addressing the French context. We must understand that France has a very long and intricate history of Islamophobia and severely cracking down on minorities at large, and more specifically the Muslim minority. First of all, it's important to realize that France is one of the few countries in the West that does not recognize, from a legal standpoint, from a constitutional standpoint, that does not recognize the existence of minorities on its own. So most countries do, of course, because it's a factual reality, but it's a factual reality that comes with some legal and constitutional obligations. So because you have some minorities living on your soil, you need to make sure that the legislation you are adopting takes into account their existence, their specific identity, their specific needs, their specific requirements, and so on and so forth. You might see that in international law, for example, so many different treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Children, for example, or countless treaties mention at some point some articles where minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, cultural minorities, are not only mentioned, but their mentioning comes with a set of guarantees that the states need to implement at some point to protect them. So what France did in order to avoid that requirement, in order to avoid to protect from a legal standpoint minorities, it says it declared, and it's their official stance, that they don't recognize the existence of minorities because they have the principle of equality and the non-discrimination in place. Everyone is French, everyone is equal, we're not an apartheid state, we don't need to recognize minorities in order to make sure that minorities thrive on our soil.
So how does it, if for the layman, can you explain how does it affect? How does this affect?
It affects us in a way that essentially the government has the ability to adopt bills, legislation, laws that directly target us and does not have the requirement to adopt laws that protect our specific identity. For example, just to give you an example that illustrates that principle. In France, since 2004, in public schools, hijab is completely banned. Hijab is totally banned. It's, of course, directly targeting the a very peaceful practice of the Muslim community. The only people who wear hijab in the world are Muslims, Muslim women. So it's a bill that very specifically and exclusively targets us. If you do recognize the existence of minorities, if you do recognize that minorities and their identity should be protected, you can't, at least from a constitutional standpoint, it's harder to adopt a legislation that directly targets the Muslim community, essentially. So as a result of this loose constitutional framework, France has been able to enact so many different laws that directly, essentially restrained our freedom of religion. There's another example that illustrates that principle is the fact that since 2010, niqab is completely banned from France, from the public square. You just can't. You can't wear it. If you wear niqab outside in the streets, and a police officer comes by, you're going to be stopped and you're going to be arrested. It's completely banned. If you do recognize, if the state does recognize minorities, it's harder to ban these, it's harder to ban niqab, essentially. It's harder to restrain freedom of religion of a religious minority. And that specific loose constitutional framework, of course, is part of the how can I say that, is a specific element of the French context that allowed the French to develop their legislation in the context of the war on terror, in the context of a large war on Islam and Muslims in the last 2 decades. So as I've already mentioned, the ban on hijab in public schools, the ban on niqab in public square, and
building of organizations.
The banning of organizations and the systematic obstruction policy. Exactly, you got it.
And is it only towards Muslims, or are there other minorities that have been affected, like the Muslims?
I would argue that other minorities have been affected by the state. The state is, from a structural standpoint, Islamophobic and also racist. So Roma communities have been affected as well, but not through the same legislation. And I don't like to compare, but I would argue that the first feature of the state now as we speak is clearly Islamophobia. It's the main priority even from a political standpoint. It's we have a series of different political parties in place in France, but if there's one feature that is common to the entire political spectrum, it's Islamophobia. It's the only one, the only criteria that you could identify. And then, unfortunately, France also played a quite pioneering role in developing legislation that is commonly framed as CVE, countering violent extremism, countering extremism, which is a specific legislation that was essentially developed as a result of the war on terror in the US, in the UK, in the entire West. But in France, what's very interesting is that the French already had in place, before 9/11, a very large, let's call it anti-terror legislation. I don't like to use that word, but essentially a very large legislation that was aimed at, or supposedly aimed at, addressing political violence. And what's interesting is that other countries had some legislation in place, but they were using it against other minorities. The UK, for example, they had some anti-terror laws, but they were using it against the Irish community because there was a conflict between the Irish community and the British. What's interesting in the French context is that
the Algerians. French has a beef with Algerians.
Yeah, exactly. And they were using it against Muslims already before 9/11, especially in the 90s, as a result of essentially a very large and successful Islamic resurgence movement in Algeria that almost took power peacefully through the elections. It was very severely cracked down upon and persecuted in Algeria, and some of its members or some of its supporters, I would argue, came to France as a result of the persecution and the crackdown that took place in Algeria. And some of those members were, once in France, severely cracked down upon and persecuted by the French as well through that legislation. So there's a series of very famous trials, actually, not famous, actually, unfortunately. To me, they are famous because they were very shocking, but very large trials took place in the 90s where, when I'm saying large trials, imagine that hundreds of Muslims were put on one trial, and they were essentially framed as being violent Islamists and so on and so forth, even though they were not involved in any act of political violence, but they were supportive, at least from an ideological standpoint, of the Islamic resurgence movement in Algeria. Some of them, before their trial, they were placed in solitary confinement for 3.5, 4 years at times. So we're talking about very shocking kind of breaches of the rule of law in the French context against Muslims before 9/11. So France has that special flavor in terms of Islamophobia, because of course it's part of a larger war on terror, but it has a specific approach and a very
systematic way of imprisoning and segregating people.
Exactly.
Yeah, enforcing their laws. So why particularly France wants to do this? Is it because so-called equality, or is it to subjugate the masses, or what particularly is the hidden agenda of France? Why do they do this?
I think that what's interesting in the French context, as I mentioned, is that they have a history of conflict since the colonial era against the Muslim community. So if you look at the colonial era, especially in Algeria, not only in Algeria, of course, but I'll use the Algerian example because I myself am from an Algerian background. Their approach was quite unique in the sense that they not only required for Muslims to be quietist, like it took place in other empires. They actually tried very actively to disconnect Muslims from Islam completely, because they identified Islam very quickly as the main source for political activism and political dissent. So, in other words, and it's quite true, if you completely want to embody Islam, well, of course, you're not going to accept the idea that your land is being ruled by people who are non-Muslims and people who are extremely brutal towards you. I imagine that the French, during their conquest of Algeria and during their rule in Algeria, millions of people died as a result of their policies.
Civilization, what do they call the white man's burden? I think
Exactly. Hundreds of mosques, some of those actually dating from the times of the conquest of Algeria and the establishment of Islam in Algeria, were completely destroyed by the French. We don't have them anymore.
In Algeria by the French.
Yes, by the French, exactly. So it was quite, it was extremely brutal. And then they adopted a very, as I've mentioned, a policy of removing Islam as much as possible from the heart of the masses. And long story short, because the story was very.
So this is a sort of violence. I mean, a radical secularism. Exactly. A new form of radical. So what they counter as radical Islam, in quote unquote radical Islam, is actually to enforce radical secularism.
Exactly. That's exactly that, Achim. And that's essentially the same spirit. The same spirit that they applied during the colonial era is exactly the same one that we're facing nowadays. So to give you an example, a few months ago, the Home Office, he published a statement and he said, of course, French Muslims are welcomed in the country, blah, blah, the same kind of a PR. And then he said, and of course, the French Muslims exclusively belong to the French national community. They do not belong, in other words, to a wider ummah. They don't belong to, they should not feel any connection with other Muslims outside of the country because their allegiance must exclusively be directed towards the French state and the French Republic. So that kind of, as I mentioned, colonial frame, colonial spirit is still very much part of the Islamophobic governance of the state.
And who said this exactly?
The Home Office. He's not in charge anymore, but he's called Gérald Darmanin, and he was the. So the Home Office is it's essentially the Ministry of the Interior in France. That's how we call him, and he was in charge when the organizations like the CCIF, Baraka City, and others were closed down by the state.
Is your organization helping Muslims in France to alleviate their burden?
Yeah, we're helping people in Guantanamo, we're helping people in Muslims in the UK, Muslims around the world, but mainly the UK, at times in France and in other contexts, people that were targeted through the CVE anti-terror legislation, so on and so on, the so-called anti-terror legislation.
So, with your page and with your Cage page, I've noticed this figure, this person called Elias. Can you tell us who are you fighting for? What is this current project that you're in, and what is his story?
Yeah. Elias D'Imzalène is a leading Muslim activist in France. He's been involved in the struggle against Islamophobia for more than a decade, almost 2 decades actually. He's the founder of Islamophobia, which is maybe the main Muslim website in France, essentially.
Which means for children, right? Islam for children.
Or no, Islam and information. Islam and
information. Okay.
Information. Right. Okay. And he's a leader of the current pro-Palestinian movement. So what happened is, he's a very prominent figure. He's a Muslim leader in the French context. And a few weeks ago, he delivered a speech in a peaceful gathering in Paris, a pro-Palestinian gathering, where he denounced the genocide, he condemned the genocide, and he used the word intifada in his speech. Okay, and which is something that is quite usual and quite normal in every pro-Palestinian gathering and protest, whether it's in Paris, in London, everywhere in the world. The word intifada is something that we use quite frequently, of course. There are some websites as well that are not even run by Muslims, Electronic Intifada, for example, or other movements that use that term because it's so intrinsically connected with the Palestinian struggle for freedom.
So for the audience, can you translate intifada?
Intifada, the entire case was. How do you translate? I think you can translate that with uprising, but uprising is quite is one of the potential interpretations. You can use the protest, for example. You can use the translation of how do you call it, strikes. You can also use that at times in the Arabic language. We use that petition as well. At times, some petitions in the Arabic language are being described as intifadas. So it's quite a common word in the Arabic language, and it's not associated with strong and radical violence or acts of political violence.
So this is a linguistic hijacking of an Arabic word and whitewashing.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're getting to the point where essentially he's been charged because the state accused him of incitement to hatred and violence, and I'll explain further, but also incitement to commit crimes against the interests of the state because of that speech. And essentially, the main reason is because he used the word intifada, which, as I've mentioned, everyone uses that word. Is not the only one in the pro-Palestinian movement to use that word. Non-Muslims use that word all the time. Slogans with intifada are being used all the time. But in his case, of course, because he's Muslim, visibly Muslim, he has been framed as a dangerous and radical threat to the interests of the nation. He was put in police custody for 3 days. He was questioned for 3 days by some police officers. As a result, the charge, the incitement to commit crimes against the interests of the state, was dropped because we're literally talking about a legislation and a charge that has been applied to like double agents in times of war. So if you have a double citizenship and you're French and Russian, and there's a war between France and Russia, and you are, giving some key information, secret defense information to Russia, then in that case, you might be charged with that offense. But you're not being charged for that when you're delivering a speech denouncing a genocide, for example. So they dropped that part, but they kept the incitement to hatred and violence. And the trial took place a few days ago, actually last week, on Wednesday. And alhamdulillah, long story short, it was a very long trial. It lasted almost 8 hours. So it was very, 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 very intense. But long story short, we know that he's not going to be imprisoned. He's not going to be sent to jail. We're still waiting for the outcome, for the ruling. But the prosecutor did not ask for imprisonment. And what's even more positive is that during the cross-examination, during the questioning part of the trial, which is the most decisive aspect of the trial, he was able to successfly explain the reasons why he delivered that speech. He kept his how can I say? He didn't contradict himself. He hasn't mentioned that he shouldn't use the word intifada. No, he explained the reason why the word intifada should be used in that context, why it's extremely legitimate. And we hope, unfortunately, the way the legislation is designed, the way the French state, as you already know, is a very close accomplice to the Zionist regime. So, of course, we believe that despite our success in our political success, and despite our success in explaining the good reasons why we should continue to use the word intifada, we should continue to denounce the genocide, we believe that the court will still, unfortunately, condemning, and through that condemnation, they will essentially criminalize the very word, the very use of the word intifada, and because that's the main spirit of this entire case, was the clear and radical willingness of the state to crack down and criminalize the language used by the pro-Palestinian movement in France.
So they are going to. What you're saying is they're going to criminalize the word.
We're expecting them to essentially condemn Elias, which essentially means that the word intifada won't be essentially you won't be able to use it as freely as before, or if you do, you will essentially take a very high risk of being charged by the state, which is something completely unprecedented, not only in France, but I would argue in the West at large. We've seen attempts at criminalizing pro-Palestinian movements, of course. Samidoun in Germany has been essentially banned, and other movements as well. But to go that far, to essentially criminalize the very language, it's something that is completely unheard of and completely shocking.
What about the sentence, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? Is it also criminalized?
As for now, it's okay, but we'll see what happens in the future. they might pick up on that as well.
So, do you think this kind of rhetoric is going to ripple effect throughout Europe, or is it only going to stick to France? Because we see in Germany there's a lot of crackdown against Muslims. So, do you think it's going to expand to entire Europe? Because the other thing I see is Macron's stances are changing. I don't know how, but in the international framework, his stances are changing with Israel.
I would argue, so to respond to your first question, there's a clear willingness to criminalize pro-Palestinian movements in the entire West. That's for sure. And there's a will to expand and to continue and to severely crack down upon anyone who's denouncing the genocide and who's supporting the Palestinians in their struggle. However, this does not necessarily mean that this endeavor is going to be successful. There's going to be some resistance, and from our side. And I think that that's the key part in here. I think that if we are successful in organizing and in essentially winning the hearts of the masses, which is underway, by the way, because the genocide is just so shocking, then we stand a chance. Then we might have the ability to essentially overturn the attacks coming from the states. So it's a struggle, but for sure the willingness from their part is in there. Regarding Macron, I would argue that some of his last quotes regarding Netanyahu, regarding Israel, I think they are more PR moves because of the clear. Because you can't hide the genocide just because of for so many different reasons. It's crystal clear that the genocide it's the first live stream genocide in the history of mankind, and we're seeing it. There's no denying it. There's no possibility to just rub it up. It's not possible. But from a purely diplomatic standpoint, if you actually look at what France is concretely doing, you will very soon realize that France offered hundreds of thousands of weaponry, munitions to Israel, and we are almost certain that these munitions were used against the Palestinians. So from a concrete standpoint, the support is there. The support to the Zionist regime is clearly established, and it's not being obstructed or stopped by Macron. These are PR moves because it's a genocide. You can't overtly support it like Netanyahu does, but from a concrete standpoint, outside of the discourse, outside of the speech, and so on and so forth, from a concrete standpoint, the support is there, and it's very strong. So unfortunately, these PR, as I mentioned, these moves are essentially PR moves, but they do not translate into concrete actions against the Zionist regime.
Do you think that this can change in the near future? Like, although it can be a PR move, do you think it might change to arms embargo? Because I think recently Italy stopped sending weapons to Israel, right? They put a sanction.
I haven't seen that. Maybe I haven't seen that.
Recently,
okay.
No, I've seen it, but I'm not certain. So I'm just asking you, like, have you?
It needs to be investigated. I think it's up to us. In the end, I think it's up to us. It's up to, especially the Muslim community. What's interesting is that we have a leadership role and a leadership status in the pro-Palestinian movements, whether it's in France or anywhere else in the world. We're supposed to play a leadership role because Muslims are being butchered as we speak. So it's natural for us to be leaders in that resistance in here. So it's up to us to essentially grow from a political standpoint and grow sufficiently so that we can secure some political leverage. and essentially acquire some form of power that could result in these shifts and these policy shifts. So it's up to us in the end. I think it's not it won't come from them. It won't naturally stem from their own will to essentially stop the genocide. There's no reason why they should do it. But if we are successful in our political growth and political maturation, then yeah, why not? It's of course it's the target. It's one of the political goals that we should have as Muslims in the West.
Inshallah. So far, when you told me about Muslims have to lead, France has a population of about 6 million, close to 6 million Muslims. Am I correct?
Yeah, maybe more. We believe that could be around 8, maybe 10 million Muslims.
8 to 10 million Muslims. SubhanAllah. I mean, from the last statistics that I saw was about 5.5, 5.6. But okay, you're expecting close to 8 at least on average, which makes the population of about 7% to 10% of the population of France, right? And are we talking about mainland France, or are we talking about overseas France as well?
France, overseas as well.
Overseas. So that included. Okay, that makes sense. Now, the question would be: do you find like Muslims are politically active in either in the parliament, or I don't know if you have the Senate or the parliament, or in the protest or in boycotts or anything? So, are Muslims politically active?
Yeah, I would argue that it's in every context. Part of them are very active, others are more quietist, whether it's because of theological reasons or because of just their political behavior, their own assessment of the French politics. I would argue that we are currently going through a
Can I ask one more question? How many of these Muslims are actually French Muslims? Like with passport holding?
Majority of them, they do hold the French citizenship. They have the French citizenship.
Because a lot of them also come to France for work purposes, and they don't have the nationality. So
exactly. But most of them, they are actually French nationals. But I think that I think we're more and more active from a political standpoint. What's interesting is that we're going through a very challenging psychological climate. Because of the crackdown that we are currently facing. It's important to realize that I haven't mentioned that up until now, but a few months ago, you might recall that the Olympics took place in France, in Paris more specifically. And during the Olympics, the state very severely persecuted Muslims. It organized more than 800 raids against Muslims, and more than 500 Muslims were placed under house arrest. Essentially, what the state did is use the protection of the Olympics as a pretext in order to increase the crackdown against Muslims. So we went through 2 months of essentially fear of being raided by the state. When Muslims are being raided by the state, it must be
why particularly Muslims for the Olympics? Like, what is...
Because we're framed as potentially violent, and we're framed as a community that could, at some point, organize acts of political violence during the Olympics. So that kind of conspirational Islamophobia has taken hold of the state. So unfortunately, we went through that period, and it was very, very traumatic. Lots of Muslim leaders, whether they are imams or even not always imams, at times presidents of mosques, have been severely persecuted as well. One of them is waiting to be exiled from the country. Another one was removed from office. So we went through these months of I can't find another word, of terror, essentially, because you're waiting. You don't know if you're going to be raided at 6 a.m. in the morning. And by raid, you need to imagine that it's always very violent. It's 20 police officers coming in, destroying your door, essentially trying to scare you to death, essentially. So that kind of psychological warfare is being led by the state, and of course, it impacts the Muslim community.
And this is in Paris. This is in Paris.
In Paris and in the rest of the country, mainly in Paris during the Olympics, of course. And of course, it impacts our capacity to engage in politics, because you know that if you're going to I don't know, organize a march, organize a protest, attend a gathering, deliver a speech where you use that shocking word called intifada, at some point you could be framed as a terrorist, framed as, I don't like to use that word, but you get the point, framed as a threat to the state. So it's something that is it's quite difficult to go through that, and at the same time say, okay, I'm not going to essentially, I'm not going to refuse to engage in politics despite the clear and heavy risks of being persecuted. So, of course, it's quite challenging from a psychological standpoint, but I would argue that despite that, we will still able to be able to organize some march and to organize some protests. Despite that, during the case of Elias, for example, it was very heartwarming to see that during the trial inside the court, so many people came, so many Muslims came to show their support, to show their solidarity to Elias. So it's quite positive. But of course, some of us are completely terrified and prefer not to engage in politics, which is something that I don't. I understand that. I don't feel. I'm not going to condemn anyone or criticize their move. I understand the state of fear, but for certain, some of us, at least some of us, should and must continue and are continuing to actually lead the struggle against Islamophobia in France and the struggle against the genocide, of course. So, in terms of leadership status, as I've mentioned, I think that our credibility and our legitimacy as political leaders is twofold. First of all, it's the genocide. Muslims are being butchered as we speak. We are Muslims. The connection between us and them is a very close one. Plus, it's Palestine, so it's a very specific place. I won't go into a theological argument in here, but as you know, Al-Quds is the third holiest city, of course, in Islam. So it's a very specific place for us. It's where the Prophet ﷺ ascended to the heavens. So it's and the land of Sham in and of itself is a blessed land. There are so many hadith mentioning this. So it's very, very dear to our heart, of course. So the connection is there, and that's the first aspect of our legitimacy. The second one is the fact that we are being persecuted by the French state very severely. No one else is facing that level of pressure from the state. The state, as I mentioned, is also using its legislation against other groups. There's no denying this, but no one is facing these levels of pressure. So our legitimacy is there, our willingness is there, so it's just up to us to essentially be steadfast and essentially remain, show a level of confidence, show a level of perseverance and resilience that essentially allows us to play the main role that we are supposed to play as Muslims in the French context.
In France, like how many Muslims are engaging in politics, and also not just in France, in the European Parliament, how many Muslims are in the European Parliament? Like I think whenever I see European Parliament debates, I think only one of them I've seen a brown person, but most often it's white people. So I'm not categorizing like French people cannot be Muslims, but I'm just saying, do we have like colored minorities, but also like different religious minorities? It doesn't have to be, it can be a white Muslim as well. So do we have those people representing in the European Parliament and in the French Parliament?
I think that I don't have any data. Some Muslims are in parliament, whether it's the European Parliament or the French one, but it's not necessarily the main criteria that illustrates our political growth and our political strength. We have at Cage and myself, we don't necessarily believe in institutional politics. We believe that for a series of structural reasons, it's extremely hard to be in these places of power and essentially impact policies in a structural way. But to me, the main political path for Muslims is rather autonomy, building places of power outside of these institutionalized places of power that are extremely hard to. It's extremely hard for any Muslims to be actually introduced in these places, or when they essentially have to compromise so much on their values, on their discourse, on their political targets, that in the end you get on the you have a seat on the table, but unfortunately, at times you are also on the menu. So you don't necessarily have the ability to essentially have the same discourse, and it doesn't. If you have a role, but the way you get the role is to completely abandon the reason why you want that role in the first place, then it's completely it doesn't make any sense. So it's
So you think you would say that it's not beneficial or the interest of Muslims to get into politics and being in the parliament itself?
It's not as beneficial as it's being framed. If you are part of the majority, you're white, you're non-Muslim, I get the point, of course. You're going to be there. You don't have to compromise so much on your values, your discourse, your political goals. But in our case, I would argue it's slightly different. And in the last few decades, we've seen actually Muslims trying to be there, at times getting there, but we've never seen any substantial results being secured by this kind of political engagement and endeavor.
But is it also because these leaders, once they get in, they have lack of support by the Muslims? Because I know that Muslims don't generally engage in politics. We stay abstained from politics. So do you think it's lack of support? Because recently, I'm sure you've watched, videos of what is happening in the US, the elections and stuff. So I recently heard that some of these democratic parties, they are in support of Muslims, but when the genocide happened, they abstained and they sticked with the Zionists. And the reason they said is because Muslims don't engage in politics and they cannot keep them in power. They cannot keep them in the seats. So.
Well, I would argue that I disagree with the way they frame us. I would argue that even these Muslim the MPs that at times are from a Muslim background, most of them, they actually were able to reach that position because of some Muslim support, because of a large Muslim support. They always have. It's never a very personal path. You're always supported by your community. I would argue that it's the way. For example, you use the example of the Democrats. It's natural for them, and that's the only argument they can use. But to me, it's completely fallacious. I think that, especially in the US, actually, where I believe that Muslims are more engaged in politics rather than, for example, in France or in other places. I think that's the way they have to frame us in order to justify their support of the Zionist regime. But first of all, I would argue that even if we're not engaged in politics, you're not supposed to support the genocide. Even if the community that's being targeted is not there. And secondly, we are engaged in politics. I would argue that we do not have secured enough political leverage. But that's another discourse. I agree with that part. And I think that leverage can be secured not only through institutional politics. If you want to go there, fine. But there are other ways. To me, the problem is that at times when we talk about institutional politics, we frame it as the only solution. We have to be there, or not, it's over. But it's not the case. I would argue that other communities have proven that through autonomy, through building our own power, we are able then to create a new status quo and to use some political leverage in our favor, even though we're not necessarily represented in these places of institution.
And how do you mean by autonomous structure? Like, can you give us a short explanation?
Yeah, short explanation is hard, but essentially it would mean that we are building a sense of community and a community that essentially operates without the infiltration, the need, or the support of the state. You see, the moment we'll be able to have a community, for example, where we can sustain ourselves without the support of the welfare state, for example, or the moment we will have a community where we can organize protests, gatherings, activism, forms of activism that are very large and very loud, without necessarily being supported by the state.
But don't you think if you don't have representatives in the political sphere, they might crack you down because you don't have the head, you don't have that?
I would argue that if we are large enough, and if we have multiple heads in that autonomous group, then you can protect yourself in a more efficient way against the crackdown. For example, one of the reasons why the state cracked down on us so easily a few years ago is because we only had one anti-Islamophobia group. So all they had to do is essentially crack down on them, and then you don't have anyone else doing the job. So if you have a larger galaxy of movements, organizations doing similar work, not always the same work, but playing similar roles and roles that are complementary, then it's way harder for the state to destroy you. Because even it's like, imagine, think of the hadith of where the Prophet ﷺ is referring to the Ummah as a body. So if you want the body, but if you only have, how can I say that? If you only have one head, okay, fine, you sever the head, it's over. But if it's a large body, it's an established body, then it's way harder to essentially bring it down. So it's the same metaphor that we need to apply, I think, to the political growth of Muslim communities in the world.
Inshallah. So again, one last question would be: how does French how is France being a standard for the other European countries to crack down? Because, like I said, Sweden, Norway, what do you call it? I mean, right now we have a rise of Islamophobia everywhere in Europe. So how essential and how is France being a model, a testing ground for the secularists on Muslims? How is that being a testing ground for other countries to follow that lead, and how we should prepare ourselves?
Yeah, I think that, as you mentioned, France is a key pioneer in terms of Islamophobia and is the political leader of Europe. So it's, of course, every country, in every European country, in terms of Islamophobia, but any aspects of governance is always going to include the French governance, the French policies in its own assessment, because France is, as mentioned, the clear political head of Europe. So you have to take into account what the French are doing. In terms of Islamophobia, their pioneering role is so deep and it's so established, and it's being framed as being efficient. So, of course, any other European country is going to look for the French way of addressing Muslims. And in that sense, the struggle against French Islamophobia is so key from a strategical standpoint, because if we are able to essentially how can I tell you that, overturn Islamophobic policies in France, we know that as a result, we're also going to protect other Muslim communities outside of France, because their own governments are not going to be able to use the same policies, because they're not going to be seen as efficient, effective, and so on and so forth. So I think that from a strategic standpoint, I think every Muslim eyes must be on France as well, because the more we are pressurizing them from the inside and from the outside, the more we will be able not only to, as I've mentioned, decrease French Islamophobia, but we're also, as a result, going to decrease the Islamophobic pressure outside of France. That's very clear, and that's the reason why France is playing. That's the reason why we must constantly be aware, as Muslims living in the West, of what France is trying to do, because if they are successful in doing it, especially as we speak right now, other countries are going to adopt the same policy.
A few more questions. I mean, with your organization, how can you... Okay, let me come back to that question a bit later. Let me ask you this question first. With what is happening in the Western Sahara? I'm talking about Mali. I'm talking about Ivory Coast. French has a leverage there to this day. So things are changing in that region. How is it going to affect France's relationship with? Because we know that France had a coup quite often in those countries. So do you expect any coup again, or do you think any civil war might happen? Like, do you predict anything? Because quite often what happens is, like, if France intervenes, then these people are going to be at the doorsteps of Europe again. So do you expect anything that is going to happen, France intervening in these countries?
Yeah, I think France has an imperial agenda in the Muslim world, and more specifically in the countries and the region you've mentioned, as a result of a very simple historical fact. These countries, these regions were under the French rule during the colonial era. I would argue that even after the decolonial movement, they are still, in a way, in charge, and their leverage and their political leverage is still goes very, very deep.
The monetary system, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But what we've seen in the last few decades is an Islamic resurgence, political movements that are, which DNA is actually Islam, and one of their first political goals is to actually question the legitimacy of the French influence in that region, and that led to political conflicts. So the reason why the French are intervening is because they want to keep their political influence in that region because it's so strategic from a geopolitical standpoint. It's an important gateway to the rest of the African continent. So it's so essential for them to keep that position. But as a result of the Islamic resurgence movements, as a result of other political movements as well, it's not specific to Muslims, their leverage and their position is being questioned. Interestingly, in Mali, we were referring to Mali, France actually lost a war, what is being framed at times as their Afghanistan. So they stayed in Mali for more than 10 years and they had to leave a few months ago. They completely abandoned the country, which is, I believe, is a victory because they were not successful in trying to keep their political leverage in there. So I'm not an expert. I can't tell you exactly what the next moves are going to be. Of course, the French,
because it's a surge of countries in that region, Niger,
Sahel region, exactly, Niger, Niger, Mali, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that the French, especially the military, they are aware that what they're facing right now, the key challenge they're facing is a strategic decline, what they call a strategic decline. If you read some of their reports, it's constantly being mentioned. We are not as powerful as we used to be. It's a problem. We need to find solutions. One of the solutions they tried to implement is wars, essentially. Wars, very concrete wars against movements that are questioning their presence. But they were unsuccessful. So my hope is that decline continues, because that decline comes with, as I mentioned, mass killings, mass destruction in Muslim.
It reduces.
Exactly. So I hope that their influence is going to...
and they wouldn't be coming to the doorsteps of Europe. They would be back in their homelands rather than coming to Europe, which is going to affect Europe as well, yeah.
Of course, they're framing it as a migration issue, which is not. What it is about independence, political autonomy from an imperial power, which is France. That's the key aspect. So...
is France the only country which is in African countries, or is it a collaboration of other European countries? Let's say Germany is also involved in these.
Yeah, there are others, for example, the Russians, they're trying to actually infiltrate Mali and other countries in order to have a larger role and more political leverage in there. So it's still, what we're seeing right now is a large political reconfiguration. The political picture is going to change, and it's currently changing. I hope for the best for Muslims. What I can say is that for certain, we're seeing the rise of a multipolar world. We're not seeing the same dichotomy, US, Europe, and essentially the rest. Hopefully that multipolar world continues to grow and it continues to bring concrete and effective solutions for the Ummah. That's the hope. But it's very difficult, I would argue. I would remain very cautious in terms of predictions, what's going to happen next, because there are so many different elements, even experts on the field.
The reason I'm asking you this question is France takes about $500 billion euros from these 14 Francophone countries. So it is going to affect French economy, and also these resources are going to be shut down and be controlled, because it was under the hands of France. And now they are going to be controlled by the Mali government. So which is going to be a huge loss for France.
Exactly.
So for sure, they're going to retaliate. So my question is, how are they going to, retaliate by getting back Nigerian Mali resources? So yeah, I mean, it's going to be a bloodbath over Africa. So,
Yeah,
which is why I'm asking you, like, do you think it can be like the region can be protected from civil war or these interventions by Europe, or do you think it might be stable?
I think that unfortunately France will continue its agenda. Unfortunately, I think that conflict and potentially armed conflict is going to be forced upon the oppressed. It's not. At times, it's being framed as the something that we are trying to introduce. It's not the case. It's just that if an army comes to you, you're not going to organize a march. You see what I mean? You just have to respond to the ways these imperialist powers are actually targeting you. But so yeah, it's a possibility. But we'll see if, for example, if the Muslim community in France continues to grow and continues to build some political leverage, maybe we're going to force France as well, not only to stop its support of the genocide, but also maybe to stop its imperial agenda against other Muslim countries. Who knows? It's ambitious, but it's the only ambition we can afford.
So how can Muslims in France or in Europe in particular galvanize and become strong organizations? So what do you expect? What is the first step?
It's a large question. It's an essential question. I think the first thing comes down to our understanding of the Deen and our understanding of our role in here. And without going into too much details, we have a specific political role to play, and Muslims have a specific political role to play anywhere in the world, whether it's the West or whatever. You are always supposed to endeavor to make sure that the word of Allah is supreme, and that's not a choice. It's just a natural consequence of what we believe in. So our deen is a deen. It's not a culture. It's a way of life. It's a proper way of life. There was an activist during an Indian activist of the Khilafah movement. He said Islam is a complete synthesis of life. Complete synthesis of life. And we're struggling as well from a political standpoint because we believe that the best model of justice is the one that was brought by the Prophet. So that's what we want to that's the kind of mercy that we want to share to the world. So that's the kind of I think spirit that we need to embody. We're not just here to stay for a while, acquire some estate, whatever. Then at some point we're going to go back to our land. That's not you see what I mean? That's not really the Islamic spirit. So the moment and of course, not everyone is going to engage in politics or engage in that kind of stuff. It's natural, but there needs to be a strong minority amongst us. It's always going to be a minority, but a strong minority, a confident minority, a minority that is well aware of that political goal, and that is going to essentially engage in that path.
I'm aware of you might not have a roadmap, but can you give some steps? Because you're in Paris, but there's a big chunk of population in Marseille, Strasbourg, and Lyon. So can you at least share some steps? Because they have different organizations as well. How can you...
I think for example, in France, every local community, make sure that you're protecting your mosque, make sure that your mosque and your NGOs are independent from the state. One of the key things that we're facing in here, for example, is that the state has so much leverage and pressurizes so much the boards of the mosques. You don't want that because they're not Muslims, okay? So they have their own political agenda. Make sure that you're protecting your mosque, that you're protecting your NGOs, that you're protecting anything, any organization or association, anything from the influence of the state. Make sure that you are properly independent, because if you're not, you're going to rely on them and they have their own agenda for you. So at some point, what we're seeing, for example, right now is imams being removed from office because they're quoting a hadith the state does not like. So, for example, they're saying, an imam was removed from office a few weeks ago, actually, because of a hadith on marriage or the Islamic teachings on marriage. we're not going to change the teachings, the Islamic teachings of marriage. So make sure that their influence just does not exist. And even if you're trying to pressurize your imam, even if they're trying to pressurize your mosque, make sure that you're going to protect them, that there's not going to be any consequence as a result of that pressure. So make sure, in other words, to be autonomous, to be independent.
Do you have a model, within your organization that people can learn from? Like, do you have any kind of model like that?
Yeah, we published I think it was a month ago a some kind of a plan, a 10 I'm going to share that with you guys for a conscious Muslim, and it's something that can be applied primarily in the British context, but it can be adopted and slightly adapted to your own context as well. So I think that plan started by Cage a few months ago. It's a 10-step plan, and it's something that could be a source of inspiration.
So where can people find this information? Can you let me know?
On the website of Cage, the Conscious Muslim Guide. It's on the website, and I think it's something that provides some level of guidance that you can implement in your own communities.
Inshallah. So I'll ask one last question and then we'll conclude. So one last question would be, what is happening in Sudan right now? How can the Muslims help the people of Sudan? Because I think 500 people were killed just this week. And so how can the Muslims help the people of Sudan in European context or even in French context?
SubhanAllah, I'm not an expert on that specific context, so I don't want to go into any details because that could make mistakes, and I don't want to. It's a very serious question, as you've mentioned. I think just raising awareness as much as possible on what's currently happening on the field, on the ground, and trying to find ways to support people who are being oppressed. Of course, again, I don't have a detailed understanding, but for sure, I'm sure you have humanitarian NGOs trying to go there to support Muslims, trying to support them as much as possible, and trying to learn. And myself, learning on the context as possible in order to understand what's currently happening. Politics is complex, but that doesn't mean it's we can't identify the key patterns and the key solutions for Muslims, inshallah.
Sure. So last question is finally concluding. How can people reach out to you if they need any help from you, or if they have any questions? So can they reach out to you or your organization? Can you share us?
Of course. If you are affected by the anti-terror legislation, the CVE legislation in your context, you can reach out to us, and a team of caseworkers is going to read your case and see if we can help. Of course, most of the time we're helping. Majority of the time, people in the British context. That's where we are. So of course, that's our expertise. But in some cases, we can also support you if you are outside of the British context. Of course, it will go through a proper assessment from our team. And if we believe that we can help you, we have the expertise, the knowledge to help you, of course, we will, inshallah. And just reach out to our website. We have a series of emails, and all you have to do is to send an email.
The website is cage.org.
No, cage.ngo.
Cage.ngo. Okay.
Cage.ngo. And you can reach out to us. There's a specific section where you can send an email, and we'll go through your queries, and if we can help, we will, inshallah.
Inshallah. May Allah reward your efforts and your team's efforts. Jazakallah khair, brother.
Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.